Welcome back to the High Tech Forum podcast. I'm your host, Richard Bennett, the founder of High Tech Forum. And today we're happy to have as a guest Mary Brown, a senior director at Cisco Systems. Mary's someone I've known, crossed paths with several times in the world of spectrum policy, what Aspen Institute conferences and the like. And Mary just recently it's been a couple of weeks now since you testified at the congressional hearing March 16th. Oh, a month on 5G and beyond, exploring the 5G, exploring the wireless future. And it's one of those hearings that, like a lot of hearings, it started off with a pretty narrow theme and then kind of evolved to where the real interesting issues were in a set of policies that includes spectrum auctions, intergovernmental cooperation on spectrum, and U.S. leadership in wireless technology. And so, yeah, I guess the announcement and the framing did their job of drawing people in, and then the experts on the panel were able to kind of shift the direction of the conversation to some pretty substantial issues. Was there anything that you wish you'd been able to say? I know in these hearings you submit probably 30 minutes worth of written testimony, and you've got 5 minutes, and a whole lot of stuff ends up on the cutting room floor. So is there anything you wish you'd said that you didn't have time to say?
I think if I had one observation to point out to the members of the committee, it's that this is the first time I can remember where Congress is being asked to reauthorize spectrum auctions, which need to be reauthorized this year, where there is not a very long list of spectrum bands that industry has identified, that they a very short list. And that's very unlike years past when spectrum reauthorization has come up, and there generally has been quite a robust set of asks that industry has brought to Congress. So it's a little different this year. The list is quite short.
Well, is that like, I mean, I remember some of those kind of spectrum pipeline plans in the past had like dozens of narrow little 5 megahertz slices, and sometimes even less than that. And nowadays it's sort of like budget bills. Like nobody bats an eye unless your budgetary item is over $1 trillion. So, so there's a lot of $800 billion stuff going on, but they were talking about, well, the 6 megahertz band, like the 6 gigahertz band, the whole thing, the whole 1,000, so it's like in units of 1,000 megahertz or 1 gigahertz at a time. And like, and 4, 5, 6, 7. So yeah, I mean, it's not really all that refined, is it?
No, and part of that is the technology. So whether you're talking about 5G sliding into 6G or Wi-Fi 6E sliding into Wi-Fi 7, these are all technologies that use common modulation approaches that require very wide channels. And so those old days when people could identify 5 megahertz here, 5 megahertz there, and that was actually meaningful in prior incarnations of the technology, those aren't meaningful anymore. Whether you're talking 5G or Wi-Fi, you need big chunks of spectrum, and it's getting harder to identify those big chunks.
Yeah, and that 5 megahertz stuff, that was like cell phones, because in 5 megahertz you could pack a lot of phone calls in there, but that's not the thing anymore. Well, it's also the case that as we get up into the higher frequencies, the bands have to be fatter, because the signals don't propagate as well, and so you compensate for that by using wider bands, and then you get the resilience back that you lose because you've got the short wavelengths. Yeah, and it is interesting that well, a lot of the discussion and spectrum policy from the outside is on this, like licensed versus unlicensed. But when you dig into the technical features like the modulation, it all tends to be, it all tends to be OFDM, and there's a lot of commonality in that. And but yeah, obviously there are huge differences in controlling access to the airway, to the getting transmission rights, basically packet by packet. That's where the differences come in. Does it seem to you like the ultimate focus, what I got out of it was that Congress is pretty content with most of the 2 gigahertz band is going to continue to be licensed, with the exception of the 100 megahertz or so for Wi-Fi at 2.4 to 2.5. And most of the 3 gigahertz is going to be licensed, with the exception of the CBRS slice, whereas that's like towards the bottom. It's about 150 megahertz. There wasn't really detailed talk about 4 gigahertz, other than it's being used in East Asia for 5G. So it would kind of make sense to use it in the US for 5G as well. But I take it there's some incumbent users, probably some government users in the 4 gigahertz band. 5 gigahertz is pretty much all Wi-Fi, with the exception of the tiny little transportation slice at the very high end of it. Gee, I have a coffee cup that has that NTIA spectrum map. That's what you go to their events in Boulder. That's the bling you get. And then 6 gigahertz is obviously all, I guess, pending lawsuits and stuff. It's probably going to remain in the hands of Wi-Fi 6E. And then 7 gigahertz is another candidate band for, I guess it'd be easy to expand Wi-Fi into the 7 gigahertz space. But it could also end up being interesting for provide, or probably by then it's 6G or 7G. And then, there's a big sort of an empty space, because the millimeter wave allocations start at about 22 gigahertz. And so between 7 and 22, I don't know what is actually going on in there today, but all of those they're sort of candidate bands if we can ever figure out how to make, say, the millimeter wave stuff work, for mobility outdoors.
There is some discussion going on around 12 gigahertz between commercial satellite and commercial terrestrial, and what the 12 gigahertz band should be. That's not something I'm particularly expert in. I've looked at it a little bit. There are some substantial issues around whether those things can coexist and what the rules would have to be, but that's one band in between mid-band and the millimeter wave that is being considered. At least it's alive.
The low Earth orbit, like Starlink, uses that, don't they? Use that 12 gigahertz?
Correct.
Yeah. And a lot of that is unlicensed. I mean, it's kind of amazing that a lot of what Starlink is using some unlicensed spectrum, but I think it has the effect for them, because there aren't that many people launching satellites, that it ends up being exclusive use, just by, the practical problem of, if you don't own a satellite, a rocket ship company, you're kind of disadvantaged. But yeah. So there is kind of heartening to know that we haven't stopped innovating in spectrum, and there's going to continue to be more demand for it. Where does the spectrum come from to have a reliable spectrum pipeline? And it seems to me, I want to hear what you have to say about that. But my take on it is, well, the history of spectrum allocation is that we didn't allocate like to technologies or even to companies. We allocated to specific applications. So it's kind of like if Facebook had started in 1920, or 1935, they would have had to go to the FCC and ask for a Facebook allocation to be able for people to communicate with them. And as time has gone by, we've come to realize that There really aren't that many different applications in the world, at least from the standpoint of how they use communications bandwidth. So we don't have to, these things don't have to be so heavily specialized, right? And so where the spectrum comes from is that we take these old allocations and just bring them up to date. And so, there's, say, 5 federal agencies that want to do surveillance. Well, they can basically all use the same. I mean, that's not really all that different from what Google does. So there, you don't have to have a special allocation for that.
Yeah, no, it's certain. What you say is absolutely true. We did allocate spectrum based on use cases. Someone would come up with a great use case, and the FCC would get very excited about it and give them a lot of spectrum. And then some of that was dated to its time. So a really good example of that is the educational broadcasting service at 2.5 gigahertz. That was spectrum that the FCC gave by lottery to licensees in order to be able to provide educational services on. So the idea was you would have a special receiver in your home, you would get educational content from a local, community college or university, or you'd get religious content from your church, and you'd be able to view that at home, which sounded like a really cool idea in the early 1980s before there was an internet. But
Yeah,
now
right.
you sort of scratch your head and say, why would we need that? But the licenses were there, the allocations were there, and so the FCC then has to transition that band to what I would call a 21st century use, right? And so all of the complexity of how do you sort of roll all that spectrum up into something that's usable, is that a process that the private market can do? And in the case of that band, the private market did a lot of the work by rolling those licenses up together. But the FCC had to finish the job.
Yeah, and Sprint was going to do what was it? WiMAX in the 2.3. They're going to do 2.3 gigahertz WiMAX because that was pre-LTE. So technologies are still up in the air, and they were going to do that. Well, that obviously helped them become a takeover candidate. So yeah, they got all the spectrum. They can't figure out what to do. So that's right. That's
correct. And then T-Mobile bought them, and now it's a mid-band use in T-Mobile's 5G network. Right? The FCC.
What does the FCC have to do to finish off the job there?
Well, there are still some unused patches of that spectrum that have been laying fallow, and this year the FCC is trying to auction those off. They're trying to do so. They are racing the clock because their auction authority is going to expire at the end of the federal fiscal year, which is the end of September. So they've tried, I believe they're scheduling an auction for July to try to get those blocks of spectrum auctioned off. But they would be a lot happier if their auction authority were extended. So in case anything happened, they could complete their work. So that little bit remains, but most of the band is already converted. And there have been lots of policy debates about that conversion process that have taken a long time. And
so are people actually, I guess there probably would be some schools and that have been using that. But I mean, it's the way these things usually play out is there like maybe 5 or 10 schools across the country that are using it, and then you don't want to leave them high and dry, but by the same token, most of it is fallow.
Yeah, and it's fallen off through the years. I mean, it used to be that there were a number of schools that were using it. One of the big users was the Roman Catholic Church. Really? I can remember, yes, I can remember being at the FCC when the Roman Catholic Church sent in some high-ranking official. It was not the Pope, but they sent in some high-ranking official to try to convince the commissioners to retain the allocation as is. This was a number of years ago, because they were using it to broadcast their Sunday services and other kinds of services to their parishioners.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always been, I mean, Sunday church services have always been one of the big radio applications. I mean, when commercial AM radio took off, I mean, it was all either sort of band music or Sunday morning sermons. So,
right. And of course,
yeah.
now, in 2022, we stream those services, right?
Yeah,
If
right.
you're going to be at home, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the need for use of over-the-air waves has been rendered less important over time.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found really engaging in especially in your written testimony, and there was some discussion about it in the verbal back and forth, especially Representative Carter, I think, brought it up about the need to have a trusted technical authority on spectrum to help resolve the spectrum disputes like the one we had between the FCC and the FAA, or the aviation industry and 5G carriers. And you brought up the fact that there's a resource in Boulder, the Commerce Department, NTIA's Institute for Telecommunication Sciences, and apparently Congressman Carter has a bill to increase the funding for them. And I'm, they're basically in my neighborhood, so I go to their events, including the ISART conference that they generally hold in the summer, and it takes on some really important issue in wireless network design. The last face-to-face one was about modeling 5G propagation. And yeah, it was a good conference. I did a podcast with Keith Grimbon about that after it was over, when he was at the time the director of ITS. Maybe it would help if you'd explain, like, what role did NTIA play in resolving disputes like this FAA FCC thing when everything in government was fully functional, or more than it has been for.
So our friends at the National Telecommunications and Information Agency, NTIA, have been laboring away inside the Commerce Department as essentially the federal coordinator on spectrum usage. And they're the ones who hand out the assignments to the different agencies. So they get to tell the FBI what spectrum they get to use, and they get to tell FAA what they get to use. And they resolve issues between the agencies, and they are supposed to interact with the FCC on behalf of the federal government. So the way that the system is set up to work, if a federal agency or federal interest has a problem with something that the FCC is doing, they come and make their case to the NTIA. The NTIA can then engage with them. They might completely agree. They might modify what's to be presented to the FCC. But in any event, they then turn to the FCC and provide their feedback from the federal perspective of whatever it is the agency is trying to do. And then the FCC onboards that. I don't want to say that they necessarily weight the NTIA view more seriously than other stakeholder views, but the NTIA view is taken very, very seriously inside of FCC spectrum policymaking. So that relationship goes back a number of years. Unfortunately, what we've seen lately is that process has started falling apart a little bit. It also fails to address the question of what happens when the constituents of federal agencies have a problem with what the FCC is doing. So the most famous recent example is the aviation industry, was unhappy that 5G cellular was being placed into the upper part of the 3 gigahertz band, not necessarily adjacent to radio altimeters, but close enough that the aviation user community felt there was going to be interference.
Yeah, a
And
mere 200 megahertz away.
yeah, they were 200 megahertz away. So the user community was the one that had the problem initially. The FAA did not. And the FAA, it's not really clear how much the FAA and NTIA engaged this issue early on. And the user community just kept feeling like their voices were not being heard. No one was taking them seriously. They didn't feel as if the FCC was a neutral decision-making body. And so as the proceeding marched on and then finally got decided, that group continued to raise questions and concern until finally the FAA started to take public positions about this issue. But that came fairly late in the game, I think, from what I could see.
Yeah, I mean, I know there was an NPRM about all this that was like, what, 3 years ago.
Yeah, 3 years ago. Yeah.
And Boeing raised some issues and they wanted a guard band. And so they asked the FCC for a guard band, and the FCC said, fine, we're going to give you a guard band and then 50% more. Or we're going to double it just for the heck of it. And so Boeing, I don't know, maybe they discovered they ended up being part of the group that was lobbying against the deployment of the 5G deployment.
5G. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess maybe there was some learning or I don't know why these people take the positions they do, but so the thing that was so weird.
They never felt that they got heard by a neutral party. And the NTIA is really set up to represent the agencies. It's not really set up to represent the constituents of the agencies.
Yeah.
So it was, the whole thing was a bit of a mismatch. Meanwhile, the FCC is sort of sits in a quasi-legislative capacity. They take in information that stakeholders bring to them, but they themselves don't do independent research on issues like, is 5G going to interfere with altimeters? They don't do independent research. They have parties bring them research that's been done and they evaluate it from an expert perspective, but they're not independently doing anything.
Well, they do some, they do some testing and they try to figure out how to certify products and all that, which they have some sort of lab.
They do certify products. Yeah. So the result was that we all ended up with a lot of nightly news coverage about how planes might fall out of the sky if the carriers 5G. It was a hard to know what the reality of those assertions were, but it made for some lovely news stories. Media, right? The news media made out very well in all of that. But the end result was finally the issue got moved to the Boulder Lab, to your point, where experts could actually take a look at the altimeters, take a look at the 5G radios and determine, is there an issue? To what extent is there an issue? Does the issue affect all altimeters or just some? Unfortunately, that did not happen until the fall of 2021.
Yeah.
And think of how different the dynamic would have been if we had in the lab back in 2018, when the issue was being initially considered, right?
Well, this all came up during a period when NTIA didn't actually have a permanent administrator. They went through after Dave Rettel stepped down, there were, went through a series of like 4 different acting administrators, and there was also a lot of turnover at ITS because Keith left, and several other of the major technical talents left circa 2017, 2018, something like that. And so and you had new staff at FAA as well, because the administrator at FAA during the height of this controversy was a Trump appointee who only took office, I think, around 2018. Had been a former sort of logistics guy at Delta. And I mean, obviously not a radio engineer. And so there's just the mere fact that that the aviation industry felt like they had to stand up and talk to the press themselves, or the FAA had to talk to the press themselves rather than resolving this thing inside the government umbrella, with FAA and FCC and NTIA all and ITS all together, became this sort of public spectacle. But I don't know how much of that is just you've
if
got a
we
bunch
had
of rookies.
had, right, to your point, I mean, if we had had sort of experienced people at the helm and stable leadership in all of these positions, those people might, by virtue of their leadership capability, they could have overcome this and gotten sort of a rational evaluation done of whether there was a problem or not, or to what extent is there a problem.
Yeah.
But the underlying point for me is institutions are not set up, or have not been set up, to take to work collaboratively on an analytical approach that delivers to the user communities information that will convince them of the extent of the problem, or maybe there's no problem, maybe it's a limited problem. So we don't have we don't have that collaboration muscle working at all at this point. And I think the members of the United States Congress, at least the committees of jurisdiction, are getting fatigued from hearing about these disputes, which should be resolvable if you put smart engineers on the problem to try to figure out what is actually going on.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have problems like this so much in the past, I think, because it's just based on, it's not really institution design. It's just like having competent people who are kind of mature and experienced and have expertise and good faith. And they just say, well, I don't know what the law says, but I know this is what has to happen technically for these things to play together.
Yeah.
And it was obvious from the filings that aviation did through that. They had a couple of there's a research lab and a lobbying group that filed documents, and what they found was that it's possible to take an altimeter into a lab, blast it with 3.8 gigahertz radiation at a certain level, and cause the receiver to overload and your readings to get all hokey. And so that's would be kind of obvious to anyone that understands basics of receiver design. But the thing that was obviously missing from that is that they had really no way to know how 5G signals propagate. So they had no way to calibrate the exposure levels they were using in the lab to what you would find in the real world. And because they hadn't, I mean, they could have determined that empirically just by equipping planes with sensors that looked for that, for frequencies like that. And they also could have done it with modeling. And it turns out it's not really an exact science, because that's like that ISARC conference I was talking about. That was like the whole deal was about, well, there are a bunch of people that have propagation models, and there's academic work on that, and there's an industry that does propagation models. And the reason they do it is because, especially with millimeter wave 5G, you really need to know what the propagation characteristics look like over a particular terrain before you start putting up antennas, because you don't want to put them in the wrong place, and you don't want to put up too many, and you don't want to put up too few. So and it's not like once you get a permit to put up an antenna, it's not that easy to say, oh, well, it really needs to be 50 feet up the hill. Uh, that means you got to go back and get a whole new permit. So, these things there's lots of money involved in it. So, but yet the science is somewhat inexact. And I don't know whether anybody, you sort of, somebody has to be willing to spend the money, right? And so, did NTIA even have the budget to go out and figure out what the propagation characteristics of 5G around airports are going to be like?
Yeah, I don't think NTIA has the money. And in fact, one of the things that I said in my testimony is, if we are going to try to put unlike systems, radio systems, closer together, or try to allow systems to share spectrum, we as a country would be very well served by funding research in propagation models. And, a lot of that work has been done at NTIA. It's also been done at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We have government experts who can do this.
Yeah,
But
NIST they're in the same building in Boulder with
yeah,
NTIA.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
But it's shocking at some level how primitive some of our understanding is of radio wave propagation. I mean, I know in the 6 gigahertz band, when regulators have been, FCC and other regulators around the world have been looking at Wi-Fi in the 6 gigahertz band, one of the questions is, well, if you have it indoors, how much signal actually makes it outdoors that potentially could be a problem for fixed service microwaves?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's called building entry loss. Well, when you start
Mm-hmm.
digging into the international standards on building entry loss, what you find is a little surprising. It's sort of these random studies that have been brought in by random countries of random buildings where the researchers have measured building entry loss, I'm sure very accurately. But what is missing is, why is this particular building in Japan relevant to understanding building entry loss in, I don't know, Dallas, Texas?
Well, I
Our
mean, a
understanding
lot
of
of it
these
comes
things
down to
is
materials,
fairly
doesn't it?
primitive, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we need better propagation. We need a better understanding of radio propagation generally. And that there could be a big role for the Commerce Department through NIST, through NTIA.
On the question of licensed versus unlicensed spectrum is the best thing for small networks. So where the latency from one point in the network to the furthest point is below a certain level, then there's really no gain from the kind of access control mechanisms that you have in licensed systems. So with Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, and the sort of designed propagation distance of Wi-Fi is 300-foot radius from the access point. And of course, in practice, some people can stretch that out to miles. So it's and when they do stretch it out to miles, the access controls, the CSMA algorithm is completely shot to hell. But maybe it doesn't matter, because it's like in that Elon Musk case where there's not other users in that, that outdoor, that huge span. But, and so, that's kind of the indoor. So unlicensed is the indoor technology, and then the outdoor technology is some kind of licensed system with 3GPP with access controls, and then that enables you to get all the efficiency. I mean, Wi-Fi is not terribly efficient, but it doesn't really matter because there's a big spectrum allocation and there's limited interference. Once you get a couple of houses away, then we don't affect each other. But is that too basic?
No, I think that's generally right. I think Wi-Fi's strength is indoor networking. Some of that comes from the specific radio spectrum that it uses and how that spectrum propagates at those power levels. And it is because the developers of the technology have been challenged to run radio systems in an environment where they can't manage all the transmitters. They've had to come up with ways in which unmanaged transmitters can essentially share the same radio frequencies, right? So the colloquial name for that is listen before talk. You wait until you hear a pause in the action on a frequency, and then you can transmit. It has also meant that transmissions are very bursty to allow other transmitters to talk. You get on and off the air as quickly as possible and allow other transmitters to talk. So there have been a series of sort of technical choices made with Wi-Fi that have enabled it to be a successful and fairly flexible radio technology for indoor use. So most people know it because they use it at home at the edge of their broadband network. They use Wi-Fi to connect to devices in their house. But enterprises use it considerably in a number of settings, as you know, Richard.
Well, that was the first use case that we considered. Right? Yeah, when we were putting the thing together, that was the first use case, was corporate settings.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was easy to hook up people at their desks, but people go to meetings, and that's good for that. Yeah, but I mean, these things never go actually where you think they're going to go.
The predecessor of Wi-Fi was actually retail point of sale.
Right.
Before it ever got standardized, it was retail point of sale.
Yeah, I mean, Greg Ennis, who was the technical director for the Wi-Fi Alliance forever, I don't know, maybe still is, was one of the really super important architects of Wi-Fi, and he was a consultant working for Symbol, and they were, it was a scanner, handheld scanner. They wanted a handheld scanner that didn't have to be wired. So, and NCR was a big player in it too, and that pretty much the same deal. Oh, and by the way, that listen before talk thing, one of the cool features in Wi-Fi is there's a little refinement where you can prioritize different transmitters or different packets by the amount of time they have to wait after the end of a packet before they can transmit. So there's this thing called 802.11e where they lay that out, and it's actually pretty cool. And it's all controlled by random numbers that are drawn within a certain range. There's some really nice stuff in the design of Wi-Fi. I think there is there's such a thing as unlicensed LTE, right?
There is, yes. The 3GPP community wanted to develop a 3GPP based technology that would work in the unlicensed bands. And so we have something called New Radio Unlicensed, which is currently available, I believe, only in the US, but that's expected to change over time and become more available. So operators may prefer to use NRU as part of their network deployments or with devices that they have attached to their network, or may wish to make it add it to devices. So devices would have both Wi-Fi and NRU in them.
Yeah, I mean, I can see huge use for that because of the fact that one of the things that people are going to do with 5G is process control. So in factories, like I don't know what they're going to do in the Elon Musk Gigafactory in Austin, but it's supposed to be the most highly automated car factory that's ever been built.
Mhm.
So there's a whole lot of machines in a factory like that that have to be coordinated.
Mhm.
And so and a lot of them have to move around. So if you got a robot that has to move around, obviously you don't want to, that's not going to be a wired robot. And well, and the machines are all moving. So it's going to be, it seems like a just sort of a naturally wireless application.
Yeah.
But it's also
And
something that needs to have the kind of deterministic, uh, low latency access to the airwaves that you can only get in an exclusive use, kind of scenario, right?
yeah, it's interesting you raise that. I mean, right now, many of those use cases are being met by Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about an Amazon fulfillment center using a lot of robotics, a lot of connected technology in those warehouses, those today are going to be running off Wi-Fi. The access to the 6 gigahertz band, which is new, still relatively new, opens up an enormous number of new channels that will enable Wi-Fi to achieve the kind of determinism that you talk about,
Mm-hmm.
that's important for some of these automated applications. Obviously, new radio 5G, not the unlicensed version that's going to run in the unlicensed spectrum, but the licensed version. Obviously, operators are hoping that they can sell what's called private 5G into
Yeah.
enterprises to show them that licensed spectrum is better than the performance they can get off unlicensed. And so the question for enterprises is going to be, is it better? Is the improvement that I would see, is it meaningful to me in some way? Or is
Yeah.
what performance I'm going to get off Wi-Fi and 6 gigahertz more than adequate for my needs? And there's going to be different answers to that question depending upon which business it is and what their preferences are and what their needs are.
Well, and who their neighbors
They
are.
are now going to have some choice, which is good.
Yeah. 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 I think the way that's going to play out, in my experience supporting Wi-Fi products, that the worst place to have Wi-Fi is in an apartment complex in San Jose, because you can be guaranteed that every one of your neighbors has, like, you know, personal hotspots, and there's so much going on in such a small space that it sometimes it works, but it doesn't work consistently. And I think that's
Well,
that's
and yeah,
one of the
congestion has been a challenge for the Wi-Fi. I mean, the Wi-Fi industry is a victim of its own success there. Again, one of the reasons driving industry to ask for the opening of the 6 gigahertz band to generate more channels so that
Mhm.
the traffic can be spread out, but also the development of
Yeah.
Wi-Fi 6E, which is a step function better than any of the Wi-Fi that's come before.
Well, for
In
that to
terms
really work to its full potential, the channel selection algorithms need to be a lot better in consumer Wi-Fi products. I mean, there's no technical barrier to making the channel selection code in your Wi-Fi router like super robust, other than it takes time to develop it. And it's most of the, especially the low cost routers, that the consumer grade stuff is built with just packaged software and hardware from one of the suppliers like Broadcom or Qualcomm, that's just basically the OEMs just take that stuff and plug and play, and they don't mess with it. Channel selection algorithms not always right, and um, they need to be more dynamic. And the initial Wi-Fi standard didn't support that very well. Like there didn't used to be a way that the access point could tell all the clients, "Hey, I'm changing from channel 6 to channel 11. Y'all have to come with me." But it can do that now.
It can do
But
that
it,
now.
yeah. Uh, but it's one of the quirks of unlicensed is like when the standard's upgraded, nobody is forced to upgrade. I mean, there's an extension to the standard, and it takes a while for it to percolate through the whole vendor community so that everybody has this thing, and you can't assume it's there. The feature is there until, well, it really is. There was a lot of talk in this hearing about spectrum pipeline, and I haven't heard that so much in the past. And it seemed to be like when the tendency in a lot of tech policy or a lot of public policy in general is to lurch from crisis to crisis. It's a lot easier to react, and you know when to stop intervening. You know when it's when you're doing that, because people stop complaining, so you must have solved the problem. But spectrum pipeline, that's important, right? I mean, so it comes from, I get, is this comes from the insight that there's never going to be enough spectrum, or the spectrum's never going to be perfectly allocated. It comes from the fact that every allocation goes stale. And because like we were talking about these use case based allocations are going to go stale after a while. And I think at the end of the day, we're going to get down to something that's like there's a licensed and there's an unlicensed, and and the license is going to be flexible use, and the unlicensed is we don't care what your use is as long as you meet the transmission guidelines.
Right.
And when we're in that state, will spectrum pipeline always be full, or will it be unnecessary, or what happens?
That's a
What
great
happens?
question. What happens when we use it all up? Well, the good news is we're a ways away from using it all up, and I think for the foreseeable future, other than the terahertz band, which we can talk about, we're still talking about realigning historic allocations that were made in the 20th century to 21st century needs. So one of the spectrum pipeline conversations involves the 3.1 to the 3.4 gigahertz band. This is mid-band spectrum that the 5G operators really want, and consider it particularly valuable for 5G deployments. That spectrum currently is occupied by federal uses, primarily Department of Defense. And so the question becomes,
Europe designated that as the 5G spectrum, right?
They designated down to 3. Yeah. And so the question is, what are the federal uses? Is there really a way to migrate them somewhere else, or is there a way to work around what's there, leaving some of it in place, but allowing commercial use around it, spectrally or geographically? So that's one consideration. And again, it's a use from the 20th century. Now it's the 21st century, and we really need more 5G. Should we change 3.1 to 3.4, and if so, how? And what is the impact to Department of Defense uses there? So that's a conversation that will be playing out if this spectrum pipeline legislation and auction reauthorization goes through. Another one is the 7 gigahertz band that was discussed also, and similar to 3.1 to 3.4, that has a lot of federal uses in it as well. And in fact, my understanding of that band is that back a number of years ago, when the FCC wanted to auction off something called Advanced Wireless Services -3, which was the third tranche of spectrum associated with what was then Advanced Wireless Services. There were a number of federal users who had to leave that spectrum. Where did they go? They went to the 7 gigahertz band. So they're newly arrived in 7
Oh my
gigahertz,
goodness.
whatever new systems they had to put in place. And now, there's a conversation about maybe we should use that spectrum for something else. And of
Well,
course, for the
maybe this is just the new status quo, right? That no
it is
allocation lasts forever, right?
no allocation lasts forever, and people are being asked to move around. Unfortunately,
Mhm.
it's usually the federal users that are being asked to move around more so than anybody else. But
Well, but
so
they
that
have one
raises
thing
the
in
question.
common. I mean, unlike everybody else who's using that spectrum, they didn't buy a license for it. It was just sort of given to, it's the
Right.
last holdout of the beauty contest is if you're a federal, agency, you're automatically beautiful. So,
You just got an assignment, right? But it does raise a question of, those uses are there for a reason. There's something that the federal government is
mhm.
doing in it that's important, presumably in the public interest for all of us. So
Well,
what
there
is
was
that?
certainly at one time, right? I mean, yeah, at one time they were doing something with it. I think some of those bands are not even, they can't tell you what
Could
they're doing
be,
with them now.
it could be, so the question is what's there now? Uh, could it be moved? Ideally, when you talk about licensed spectrum, you like to have spectrum that is cleared of other uses.
Yeah.
So what could be moved, what can't be moved, and all of that. And if the band is, substantially occupied and it's going to be tough to put 5G in there, is there an option to put some unlicensed in there? So what does that look like? So there's lots of conversations that need to happen around 7 and even up into the lower 8 gigahertz range to figure out if there are any opportunities there.
Well, I know one of the things we talked about a lot at those Aspen conferences about this question of taking spectrum out of the hands of a government agency and putting it in the private sector was that it was, I believe, one of the kind of obvious ploys that people think of as, well, how about if I go to the government agency and say, I'll donate you some equipment that will perform your application in a different frequency band or in such a way that the spectrum you're currently using can be freed up. So it's a question of modernize the application, reduce the spectrum footprint, and then you've got something you can auction off. But there's not really any provision. I mean, that's like bribing a federal agency, so you can't really do that under the law as it currently is. So maybe we just need to, make. I wrote a whole paper about that, about how upgrade and repack. That's the way. That's the process. Upgrade and then repack the spectrum, like
Yeah.
the way we've been
And,
doing this
and of
stuff.
course, commercial technology is constantly evolving. So the 5G network can do things the 4G network couldn't. So are there things
Mhm.
happening in the 7 gigahertz range that the feds are using that spectrum for that really could be served off a 5G network? But they've never thought about that before. I don't know. It's a really cool question to think about.
Mhm. Mhm.
Is to what extent do we need these federal silos to achieve agency objectives?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we've probably blown our time budget by considerable margin for this discussion already. So, um, unless you've got something to, do you have any last, oh, no wrap ups? Thank you for taking part in the podcast, and this is great. I gotta have you back again. It's been one of the better conversations we've ever had on this podcast. And folks, if you're a big fan of Spectrum or of broadband policy, tech policy in general, High Tech Forum podcasts, we do them. We try to do them on a once a month basis, sometimes more frequently, sometimes not. And you can sign up for, to get notified when one is posted, and their podcasts are available in all the iTunes and the other normal places. And the obligatory, please, give us some feedback, positive or negative. And there you go. So now you know everything there is to know about spectrum policy. Until the next time.
Thank you for having me, Richard. I appreciate it.
Oh, it was a blast. Okay, folks, Richard Bennett signing off.